Chef buys abandoned restaurant, but what he finds in the basement leaves him stunned. David Wilson felt a tightness in his chest when the keys to the Mountain Spice restaurant fell into his hands. That establishment, closed for 5 years, represented everything he had dreamed of since he was a boy. But it also brought back memories he preferred to forget. The day after signing the papers, David returned to the restaurant intending to start cleaning. The place was exactly as he remembered from the few times he had been there years ago, when he was still a young cook, trying to establish himself in the city of Aspen. As he went down the stairs to the basement, something caught his attention. Among dusty boxes and rusty utensils, there was a dark wooden chest with his initials engraved on the lid. David's hands trembled as he touched the cold metal of the lock. How was that chest with his initials there? He had never been in that basement before. He forced it open and found a stack of letters yellowed with time, all addressed to him but never sent. The first letter he picked up had handwriting he knew all too well. It was from his mother, Elizabeth Wilson, who had passed away 3 years ago. His voice failed as he began to read aloud, as if he needed to hear those words to believe they were real. The letter began with a request for forgiveness and went on to explain that she had kept a secret for over 40 years. David had to sit on the cold basement floor to continue reading. His mother revealed that the man who raised him, Robert Wilson, was not his biological father. His real father was Anthony Brooks, the former owner of that very restaurant where David now stood. The man he knew only as a grumpy, lonely old man who was always complaining about other people's cooking, including his own. David had crossed paths with Anthony a few times at local culinary events, and never imagined that man could have any connection to his life. The letter explained that Elizabeth had worked as a waitress at the Mountain Spice when she was 20. Anthony was married at the time, and their romance was brief but intense. When she discovered the pregnancy, Anthony wanted to take responsibility, but his wife was seriously ill. Elizabeth didn't want to be the one to add more suffering to that situation and decided to leave, meeting Robert months later. David dropped the letter and opened another from the middle of the stack. This one was more recent, written just a few months before his mother passed away. She said that Anthony had never come to terms with being apart from his son, and that over the years he had tried to get close in every possible way. He was the one who anonymously paid for David's culinary school. He was the one who sent the first job opportunities through influential contacts. He was the one who watched from afar every achievement of his son. David's phone rang, snapping him out of his trance. It was Jessica, his older sister. She asked if he was okay, said she needed to talk to him urgently. David could barely respond, only asking her to come to the restaurant immediately. Jessica arrived half an hour later, carrying a large cardboard box. Her face was red, as if she had been crying the whole way. She placed the box on one of the dusty tables and looked at her brother with an expression that mixed guilt and relief. Before David could show her the letters he had found, Jessica began to speak. She said that their mother had asked her to give him that box if David ever bought the restaurant. Elizabeth was sure it would happen, saying it was fate trying to fix the mistakes of the past. Inside the box were dozens of photographs, pictures of David as a child, a teenager, a young adult. In every one of them, discreetly in the background or at the edges of the images, was Anthony Brooks. On the day of the graduation from the culinary course, he was in the audience. At the opening of the first restaurant where David worked as sous chef, Anthony was sitting at a corner table. In cooking competitions, he always found a way to be present. Jessica confessed that she had always known the truth. Her mother had told her when Jessica was 15, making her swear to keep it a secret. Jessica's work over the years had been to ensure that Anthony couldn't get too close to David. Whenever the old man tried to create a situation to talk to his son, Jessica would invent an excuse, an urgent commitment, anything to avoid the encounter. David felt the anger rise in his chest. Why had everyone decided that he didn't deserve to know the truth? Why had they taken away his right to know his own father? Jessica tried to explain that their mother was afraid of destroying the family, that Robert had always been a wonderful father and didn't deserve to be replaced by a stranger. But Anthony wasn't a stranger, David realized at that moment. Anthony was the reason he had become a cook, Every sharp criticism the old man made about other people's food was actually a desperate attempt to connect with his son through the only thing they both loved. Food was the language they shared, even without knowing they were father and son. The argument between the siblings was interrupted by the arrival of Robert, the man who had raised David as his son. He appeared at the restaurant door with a tired expression, as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Robert said that Jessica had called him, telling him about the discovery of the letters. Robert entered slowly and sat in one of the dusty chairs. He began to speak in a low voice, almost a whisper. He had always known the truth. Since the very first day, Elizabeth had been honest with him when they started dating, explaining that she was pregnant by another man. Robert didn't mind. He said he would love that child as if it were his own, and he kept that promise for over 40 years. David listened in silence, trying to process all those revelations. Robert continued, explaining that he had made an agreement with Elizabeth and Anthony. The three of them had met when David was only 6 months old. Anthony asked to be part of the boy's life, but Robert set one condition. He would be the official father, the name on the birth certificate, the man David would call father. Anthony could watch from afar, he could help anonymously, but he could never reveal the truth. The agreement existed to protect everyone involved. Anthony's wife had just passed away, and a scandal about a child out of wedlock would destroy her memory. Robert wanted to build a family without shadows from the past, haunting every moment, and Elizabeth didn't want to see her son torn between two worlds. David stood up and walked to the restaurant window. Outside, the quiet street of Aspen went about its normal routine. People passing by, cars driving around. Life went on while his world was falling apart. He thought of all the times he had crossed paths with Anthony and felt a strange familiarity, a connection he could never explain. Jessica approached and put her hand on her brother's shoulder. She said there were more letters in the chest, that David needed to read them all before making any decision about what to do with that information. Robert agreed, saying he would wait as long as necessary for David to process everything. In the following days, David spent hours in the restaurant basement reading every letter his mother had written, but never had the courage to send. Elizabeth detailed specific moments from David's childhood, explaining how Anthony had been present in each of them in an invisible way. The new toy that mysteriously appeared at Christmas was his. The scholarship to the private school was his. The money that saved the family when Robert was unemployed for 6 months was his. In one of the letters, Elizabeth revealed something that made David stop breathing for a moment. Anthony had originally bought that restaurant with the dream of one day passing it on to his son. Every renovation, every improvement, every detail of Mountain Spice Restaurant was designed so that David would one day take over the place. But when Anthony realized his son would pursue a career in larger restaurants in major cities, he decided to close the establishment and wait. The most recent letter in the pile was only 3 months old. Elizabeth wrote it when she was already very ill, knowing she didn't have much time. She begged David to forgive everyone involved, to understand that every lie was told out of love, every secret kept to protect. And she asked one last thing, that he seek out Anthony and allow the old man to live his final years knowing his son knew the truth. David discovered that Anthony lived in a nursing home in the northern part of Aspen, Hope Haven. He went there on a rainy Tuesday afternoon without warning, without planning what he would say. The receptionist directed him to room 12 on the 2nd floor. Anthony Brooks was sitting in a rocking chair, looking out the window. He had aged a lot since the last time David saw him, about 2 years ago. His hair, once grey, was now completely white, and his robust body had given way to a frail, stooped figure. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. David stood in the doorway for a few seconds, unsure whether to enter or run away. It was Anthony who broke the silence, turning his head slowly and fixing his eyes on the visitor. A faint smile appeared on his face, and he said just one word, "Son." David's legs trembled. He entered the room and closed the door behind him. Anthony gestured for him to sit on the bed, the only other seating option in the small room. The two remained silent for long minutes, just observing each other. as if trying to recover decades of distance in a few moments. Anthony was the first to speak again. He said he always knew this day would come, that Elizabeth had promised it would. He asked if David had found the letters, if he had read everything. David nodded, unable to form words. The old man continued, his voice weak but firm. He didn't apologize for honoring the agreement, said he would do it all again if necessary, because David's happiness had always been more important than his own desire to be called father. Anthony explained that Robert was a good man, the best man who could have raised his son, and that he never felt jealousy or resentment about it. David finally found his voice. He asked why Anthony criticized his cooking so much during those few times they met. The old man laughed, a low, rough sound. He said those were the only conversations he could have with his son, so he needed to make them last as long as possible. If he praised him, David would respond politely and leave, but if he criticized, his son would stay there, defending his choices, explaining his techniques, and Anthony could listen to him speak for a few precious minutes. Anthony revealed that he had a notebook where he wrote down every dish David created, every recipe he saw his son prepare in public demonstrations. He tried everything at home, trying to replicate it to feel like he was, in some way, sharing a meal with his son. David felt tears streaming down his face. He asked why Anthony never fought harder to be part of his life, why he accepted staying in the shadows. The old man replied that true love sometimes means letting go, means doing what's best for the other person, even if it destroys you inside. He didn't want to be responsible for confusing David, for creating conflicts between him and Robert, for tarnishing Elizabeth's memory. The conversation went on for hours. Anthony told stories about David's mother that he had never heard before. He talked about how funny Elizabeth was, how she lit up the restaurant with her presence, how he knew from the first day that he was lost to that woman. He described the moment she told him about the pregnancy, the fear and happiness mixed on her face. David asked about the restaurant, why Anthony had closed Mountain Spice. The old man explained that after his wife passed away, he couldn't be there anymore without remembering Elizabeth. Every table, every wall, brought painful memories. Besides, he noticed that David was carving out a different path, working in sophisticated establishments in big cities, and thought his small neighborhood restaurant would never interest his son. But Anthony confessed that he never sold the restaurant exactly because of that. He always held on to the hope that one day David would return to Aspen and take an interest in the place. He kept up with the tax payments, the basic bills, everything, so the establishment wouldn't be seized or fall into complete ruin. David revealed that he had bought the restaurant, that he had plans to reopen it. Anthony's eyes filled with tears. The old man said that was all he ever wanted, to see his son in that place, to make it the culinary temple he had always dreamed of. The nurse entered the room to announce that visiting hours were ending. David promised he would return the next day, and Anthony held his hand for a moment before letting him go. He said he had waited 43 years for that conversation, and could wait one more day without any problem. On his way back home, David called Jennifer, his ex-wife. They had separated 3 years ago, but maintained a friendly relationship because of their son Ethan, who was 15. Jennifer noticed something different in his voice and asked if everything was all right. David told her everything, about the letters, about Anthony, about the restaurant's basement. Jennifer was silent for a moment and then said that Ethan needed to know. The boy had the right to learn his family's history, to understand where he came from. They arranged to meet the next day, Saturday, to talk all three together. David spent the night awake, thinking about how he would explain everything to his son. Ethan was sensitive, inquisitive, and would certainly be confused by all those revelations. The meeting took place in the small house David rented in downtown Aspen. Jennifer arrived first, alone, and explained that she thought it better for Ethan not to be present in the first conversation. She had something to tell beforehand. Jennifer revealed that Ethan had discovered part of the truth several months earlier. The boy was at his paternal grandparents' house when he overheard an argument between Robert and Jessica about Elizabeth's letters. He didn't understand everything, but he caught enough to know there was a secret about David's paternity. Ethan became obsessed with uncovering the whole truth. He started investigating on his own, researching the family, asking indirect questions to his grandparents, trying to piece together the puzzle. Jennifer only found out about this the previous week, when she found notes in her son's room with names, dates, and connections scribbled down like a detective trying to solve a crime. When Jennifer told him about David's discoveries at the restaurant, Ethan asked to come along on the next visit to Anthony. The boy wanted to meet his biological great-grandfather. He wanted to understand the complete family history. Jennifer thought it would be a good idea, that it would help Ethan process everything better. On Sunday morning, David, Jennifer, and Ethan went together to Hope Haven. Anthony was waiting for them. The nurse had helped the old man dress in his best clothes. He greeted Jennifer politely, but it was Ethan that his eyes fixed on most intensely. Anthony asked his grandson to come closer. He studied the boy's face carefully, pointing out similarities with David, with his own younger self, with Elizabeth. Ethan, usually shy with strangers, seemed comfortable in the great-grandfather's presence. The boy had 1,000 questions. He wanted to know about the restaurant, about Anthony's life, about what his grandmother was like when she was young. Anthony answered everything patiently, happy to finally be able to share his memories with someone from the family. At one point, Anthony got up with difficulty and went to a small cabinet in the corner of the room. From there, he took out a large black hardcover notebook. He handed the notebook to Ethan and asked the boy to open it. Inside were recipes, dozens of them, all handwritten in careful script. Anthony explained that this was the Brooks family recipe book, passed down from generation to generation for over 100 years. Each person added their own creations, their culinary secrets, their gastronomic discoveries. The last recipe in the notebook was for a dish called Mountain Chicken, Anthony's creation that had made Mountain Spice Restaurant a success in the 1970s and 1980s. He had never shared the complete recipe with anyone, saving it for the day he could pass it on to his son. Anthony said he wanted to teach that recipe to Ethan so that the boy could one day teach it to his own children. The family tradition that had been interrupted for so many years could finally continue through his grandson. The following Sundays became rituals. David, Jennifer, and Ethan visited Anthony at the nursing home, and the old man taught his grandson different recipes at each meeting. Ethan wrote everything down in a new notebook, asking questions, wanting to understand not just the ingredients but also the stories behind each dish. David watched these interactions with mixed feelings. There was joy in seeing his son connecting with his biological grandfather, but also a hint of sadness and resentment for everything he himself had lost. 43 years of distance could not be recovered in a few Sunday afternoons. One day, Robert showed up unexpectedly at the nursing home during one of the visits. He was carrying a large package in his hands and seemed nervous. Robert asked to speak with Anthony alone, and David, Jennifer, and Ethan stepped out to give the two old men privacy. The conversation lasted almost an hour. When Robert left the room, his eyes were red. He waved to David and left without a word. David went in and found Anthony holding the package Robert had brought. Inside were photo albums, all the photos of David from infancy to adulthood, photos from school, birthday parties, graduation, his marriage to Jennifer, Ethan's birth. Robert was giving Anthony a piece of the life of the son he couldn't witness. Anthony cried as he flipped through the albums. He thanked Robert for it, said it was the greatest gift anyone had ever given him. David realized in that moment that his adoptive father was a much bigger man than he had imagined. Robert could have felt jealousy, resentment, but he chose generosity. The weeks passed, and the renovation of Mountain Spice Restaurant began. David hired a small crew to help with cleaning and basic repairs. He wanted to maintain the restaurant's original essence, respecting the vision Anthony had when creating that space. During the renovation, they found interesting things. An old coffee machine that still worked perfectly, decorative plates that had been stored in boxes, and, to everyone's surprise, a small wine cellar in the basement that held carefully stored bottles of wine. Jessica appeared at the restaurant on a Thursday afternoon. She hadn't spoken much with David since the day of the big revelation, keeping her distance to give her brother space. But now, she brought a proposal. Jessica suggested they host a reconciliation dinner when the restaurant was ready. They would gather everyone involved in the story: David, Robert, Anthony, Jennifer, Ethan, and herself. It would be a way to officially unite all the pieces of that fragmented family. David thought the idea was good but had concerns. How would that dinner be? What would they say to each other? How would they handle decades of secrets and lies? Jessica said it didn't need to be perfect, it just needed to be honest. The idea took shape in the following weeks. David began planning a special menu for the dinner, something that represented each person present. He wanted the food to tell the story that words might not fully express. The first course would be a light appetizer from Anthony, a recipe the old man had created in the restaurant's early days. The second would be one of Elizabeth's favorite dishes, which David learned to make from his mother as a child. The third would represent Robert, a simple but perfect bean stew, just like he always was. And the main course would be mountain chicken, the secret recipe that connected all generations. Ethan asked to help in the kitchen during the dinner. The boy had fallen in love with cooking after starting to learn from Anthony. David accepted with joy, realizing that the passion for food truly ran in the family's blood. The restaurant renovations were nearly complete when Robert fell ill during a visit to the place. He was helping David arrange the tables when he suddenly turned pale and needed to sit down. Jennifer, who was present, immediately called an ambulance. At the hospital, doctors diagnosed that Robert had had a minor heart problem, nothing serious but requiring care. He would need rest and dietary changes. David stayed by the hospital bed, holding the hand of the man who raised him. Robert took advantage of that moment of vulnerability to say things he normally kept to himself. He confessed that he always felt insecure, always afraid that David would discover the truth and reject him. He knew he didn't have his son's culinary talent, that this gift came from another lineage, and that made him feel inferior in a way. David interrupted Robert, saying that talent doesn't define fatherhood. What makes someone a father is presence, love, unconditional support. Robert had given all that and more. He had chosen to love David knowing the whole truth, and that choice was worth more than any blood bond. Robert cried in front of his son for the first time since David was a child. He said he was afraid of leaving before knowing if David truly forgave him for keeping the secret. David assured him there was nothing to forgive, only gratitude for having such a dedicated father. Jessica arrived at the hospital shortly after, bringing worrying news. Anthony had also been admitted that morning. The nursing home called saying the old man had had an episode and needed hospital care. By coincidence, he was in the same hospital as Robert, just 2 floors above. David found himself torn between the 2 men who were his fathers. He spent a few hours with Robert, then went up to stay with Anthony, then returned to Robert. Jennifer and Ethan helped, taking turns so that neither would be alone for too long. Anthony was more fragile than Robert. The doctors explained that he had several health complications that had been building up over the years. He hadn't taken proper care of himself, and now he was paying the price. The estimate was that he had only a few months to live if he didn't follow a strict treatment. The news devastated David. He had spent his whole life without knowing his biological father, and now that they finally had a chance to build a relationship, time was running out. It seemed cruelly unfair. Ethan spent the entire night at the hospital, refusing to leave. The boy divided his time between his 2 grandfathers, talking to each, keeping them company. Jennifer tried to convince him to go home and rest, but Ethan said he wouldn't abandon the family at that moment. It was during one of those long nights at the hospital that David found a second box in the restaurant's basement. He had returned to the establishment to fetch some papers and decided to search the space more thoroughly. Behind the trunk where he found the first letters, there was another smaller one, also locked. Inside this second box was a different letter. It was from Anthony, written to David with clear instructions. It should only be opened if he was very ill or near the end. David looked at the date on the letter and realized it had been written just a year ago. Anthony had already foreseen that this moment would come. The letter began with an apology for not fighting harder to be part of David's life. Anthony explained that, looking back, he realized he had been a coward. He respected the agreement with Elizabeth and Robert, but perhaps he should have been more insistent, more present, even if discreetly. Anthony wrote about the moments he cherished most in his memory. The day he saw David for the first time, still a baby, through the hospital window. The graduation from culinary school, when he sat in the back row and cried with pride. The opening of the first restaurant where David worked as executive chef, when he tried every dish on the menu and knew that his son had surpassed his own talent. But the most important part of the letter came at the end. Anthony revealed that Mountain Spice Restaurant had an old debt that he had never been able to pay off completely. When Elizabeth needed money for an urgent surgery years ago, he mortgaged the restaurant. Elizabeth tried to return the money, but Anthony always refused, saying it was the least he could do for the woman he loved and the son he couldn't raise. The debt was never collected because Anthony had an agreement with the local bank, Aspen Union Bank. The manager was an old friend who agreed to postpone the payment indefinitely. But now that Anthony was sick and the restaurant had changed ownership, the situation could change. David felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He had bought the restaurant without knowing about this outstanding issue. That meant he could lose everything before even getting started. Anger came first, followed by frustration and then understanding. Anthony was trying to warn him through that letter, giving him the tools to solve the problem. The next day, David went to Aspen Union Bank. The manager, an older man named Henry Parker, received him with a surprised expression. Henry said he had been expecting this visit for weeks, ever since he learned that David had bought the restaurant. The conversation was straightforward. Henry explained that the original debt was $80,000, but with interest and adjustments over the years, it had reached $140,000. It was an amount David didn't have available. He had used all his savings and taken out some loans just to buy the restaurant. Henry, however, had a proposal. He was a great food enthusiast and used to frequent Mountain Spice Restaurant in the old days. If David Wilson agreed to maintain the restaurant's original essence and offered free community events once a month, Henry Parker could renegotiate the debt under much more favorable terms. David immediately accepted. The idea of hosting community events actually excited him. It was a way to honor Anthony Brooks's legacy, who always wanted the restaurant to be a welcoming place for everyone, not just those with money. When David returned to the hospital to share the news with Anthony, he found the old man in one of his rare moments of clarity. His condition had worsened in recent days, and the doctors warned that he might not have much time left. Anthony listened with difficulty, but smiled upon learning that the debt issue was resolved. Anthony asked to see Ethan. The boy was in the cafeteria with Jennifer, and David went to get them. When they arrived at the room, Anthony was holding the recipe notebook he had given his grandson weeks earlier. In a weak voice, Anthony asked Ethan to promise one thing, that he would continue the family's culinary tradition. It didn't matter if he pursued this career professionally or not, but that he kept alive the love for food, for recipes, for the stories each dish tells. Ethan promised, holding tightly to his great-grandfather's wrinkled hand. Jennifer and David watched the scene with tears in their eyes. There was the continuity Anthony had always wanted, the connection between generations that had been interrupted and was now finally restored. Robert Wilson, already recovered from his heart scare, checked out against medical advice to visit Anthony. The two old men were alone for almost 2 hours, talking about everything they had lived through over the past 4 decades. When Robert left the room, he only said they had made peace with the past. The reconciliation dinner was scheduled for a Saturday, 2 weeks after Anthony was discharged from the hospital. The doctors released the old man on the condition that he rest completely, but Anthony insisted he would be present at that dinner, even if it was the last thing he did. Mountain Spice Restaurant was finally ready. David had worked tirelessly to complete the renovation on time. The restaurant retained its original charm, with the same wooden tables, the same checkered fabric curtains, the same counter where Elizabeth Wilson had served so many customers decades ago. The only significant addition was a photo wall at the entrance. There were images of Anthony in the restaurant's early days, of Elizabeth smiling in her floral apron, of Robert with young David on his shoulders, and more recent moments with Ethan learning recipes. On the morning of the dinner, David arrived early at the restaurant with Ethan. The two began preparing the dishes, working side by side in the kitchen. It was the first time father and son had cooked together professionally, and there was a natural harmony between them. Ethan was nervous but excited. David guided him patiently, explaining each technique, each secret of the dishes. The boy absorbed everything attentively, making mental notes he would later transfer to his recipe notebook. Jessica arrived at noon to help with the decorations. She brought fresh flowers, scented candles, and tablecloths that had belonged to Elizabeth. David's sister was visibly moved, saying it felt as if their mother was there in spirit. Jennifer appeared soon after with Robert, who was still moving slowly, but was much better. The man looked around the restaurant with teary eyes. He recounted that he had taken Elizabeth there on one of their first dates, when she still worked at the place. Robert had known about Anthony since then, but decided to move forward because he was truly in love. The conversation was interrupted by Anthony's arrival. He came in a wheelchair pushed by a nurse from the nursing home, but insisted on standing up and walking into the restaurant. The old man leaned on a cane and took slow but steady steps to the main table. Anthony stopped in the middle of the dining room, looking around with an expression of pure happiness. He said that moment made up for all the years of loneliness, all the absences, all the unspoken words. Seeing his son in the restaurant he built, surrounded by family, was more than he ever dared to dream. The dinner began with the appetizer Anthony had created decades ago, sautéed shrimp with passion fruit sauce and fresh herbs. It was a simple but surprisingly flavorful dish that represented Anthony's philosophy that good food doesn't need to be complicated. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us just starting out. Now, continuing. As everyone savored the appetizer, David told the story behind that recipe. Anthony had created the dish for Elizabeth on a special night when they were beginning their romance. It was his way of expressing feelings he didn't know how to put into words. The second course was Elizabeth's favorite, Sicilian lemon risotto with shrimp. David prepared it exactly as his mother had taught him, using even the same old pot she cherished. Every bite brought back childhood memories of afternoons in the kitchen learning his mother's secrets. Robert was visibly moved when tasting the risotto. He said Elizabeth would make that dish for him on special occasions, and the flavor was identical. David had not only inherited Anthony's culinary talent, but had also absorbed the love and care Elizabeth put into every meal. The third course represented Robert with a traditional Texas-style bean stew. It wasn't a sophisticated or innovative recipe, but it was perfectly executed. Every ingredient played its role, working in harmony to create something greater than the sum of its parts. It was exactly how Robert had been in life, present, reliable, essential. Anthony proposed a toast to Robert, publicly acknowledging that he had been David's true father. He said, "Blood doesn't make family. Love does," and Robert had shown more love in all those years than many biological fathers show in entire lifetimes. Robert returned the toast, thanking Anthony for respecting their agreement and for helping David in so many invisible ways. He admitted that at first he felt jealous, afraid of losing his son if the truth came out. But over time, he realized that the heart has infinite space and that David had the capacity to love all of them. Then came the moment for the main course, the famous mountain chicken. David and Ethan prepared it together, following every step of the recipe Anthony had passed down to his grandson. The aroma coming from the kitchen was indescribable, a mixture of spices, herbs, and love transformed into food. When David served the dish, there was a moment of silence around the table. Everyone looked at this creation that represented so much more than just food. It was the union of generations, the continuation of a tradition, the realization of a dream Anthony had held for over 4 decades. Anthony was the first to taste it. He chewed slowly, closing his eyes to appreciate every flavor. A tear ran down his wrinkled face. He said it was exactly as it should be, that David had not only followed the recipe, but had understood the soul of the dish. The conversation during dinner flowed naturally. There was no more tension, no more secrets. Each person shared their memories, their perspectives on past events. Jessica apologized for having been an accomplice to the lie, explaining that at the time she thought she was protecting everyone, but now she realized she had denied David the right to make his own choices. Jennifer, who had been merely an outside observer of the whole story, shared her unique perspective. She said she always knew there was something unspoken in David's family, a kind of invisible burden he carried unknowingly. Now, everything made sense, and she saw her husband finally whole, no longer fragmented between truths and lies. Ethan asked a question that took everyone by surprise. He wanted to know what Elizabeth would think of all this. The silence that followed was heavy, each person processing the question in their own way. It was Anthony who answered first. He said Elizabeth would be happy to see everyone together, but would also carry guilt for having kept the secret for so long. She was a strong woman, but also deeply sensitive, always concerned about not hurting the people she loved. Robert agreed, adding that Elizabeth was afraid the truth would destroy the family she had built so carefully. She grew up in a time and place where relationship scandals were taken very seriously, and she didn't want David to bear that stigma. Jessica revealed something no one knew. Elizabeth had started writing those letters in the basement of the restaurant because that was the only place where she felt connected to both Anthony and Robert. She would go there secretly, once a month, to process her feelings and write about the truth she kept. David then understood why the chest was in that specific location. It wasn't a coincidence, it was intentional. Elizabeth wanted the letters to be found at the heart of what connected all the threads of the story, the restaurant that Anthony built, where she worked, and that David now took over. Dessert was served, a cornmeal cake with guava paste, a recipe that Elizabeth used to make for David's birthday parties when he was a child. Ethan had helped make it, following instructions that Jessica brought, written by his mother herself in an old notebook. Every bite of the cake brought back fond memories. David remembered the simple but love-filled parties, his school friends eating cake and messing up the house, Elizabeth laughing and taking pictures with her old camera. Robert remembered how Elizabeth always made 2 cakes because she knew he loved it and would eat almost half by himself. After dessert, Anthony asked to make a speech. He stood up with difficulty, leaning on the table, and asked for everyone's attention. His voice came out weak but firm, filled with emotion. Anthony thanked each person present. He thanked Elizabeth, wherever she might be, for giving him the greatest gift anyone could give, a wonderful son. He thanked Robert for being the father he couldn't be, for raising David with love and dedication. He thanked Jessica for keeping the secret even when it was difficult. He thanked Jennifer for bringing Ethan into the world and for being there supporting everyone. And finally, he thanked David and Ethan for giving him the chance, even if late, to be part of the family. He concluded by saying he could now depart in peace, knowing the restaurant was in good hands, that the culinary tradition would continue, and that love had overcome fear and secrets. Anthony asked for one last thing, that David rename the restaurant, giving it a name that represented the union of everyone. David had already thought about that. He revealed that the new name would be Our Mountain Spice, incorporating the possessive to show that this place belonged to all of them, to the entire family that had formed through years of pain, secrets, and finally reconciliation. The evening ended with everyone helping to clean the restaurant. It was a simple activity, but there was something deeply symbolic about working together in that space. Every washed dish, every cleaned table, every swept corner represented the emotional cleansing everyone had experienced. Anthony insisted on staying until the end, even if seated in his wheelchair. He watched every movement, every interaction, recording everything in his memory. David noticed that the old man held the recipe notebook firmly, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Before leaving, Anthony called David aside. He took an envelope from his coat pocket and handed it to his son. Inside was the deed to the restaurant, which Anthony had never officially transferred. He said he wanted to do it personally, with witnesses, so there would be no doubt that the place now legally belonged to David. David tried to refuse, saying he had already purchased the restaurant through legal means, but Anthony insisted. He explained that the formal sale had only been a formality to activate Elizabeth's letters. In truth, the restaurant had always been David's from the day he was born. The following days were filled with intense preparation. David wanted the official reopening of Our Mountain Spice to be memorable. He had personalized invitations made for important people in the community, including Henry from the bank, the restaurant's neighbors, and former employees who had worked with Anthony. Ethan suggested they create a mural on the main wall of the restaurant, telling the story of the place through photos and short texts. David loved the idea, and the two worked on it for an entire week, organizing images chronologically and writing heartfelt captions. The mural began with a photo of a young Anthony opening the restaurant for the first time in 1978. Then came one of Elizabeth in her floral apron, serving customers with a radiant smile. There were photos of special dishes, community events, and local celebrities who frequented the establishment. One section of the mural was dedicated to the years of closure, with pictures of the restaurant empty but dignified, waiting for better times. And finally, the recent photos: David signing the purchase papers, the renovation, Ethan learning recipes, the reconciliation dinner. Jessica brought a special contribution to the mural, a photo no one knew about. It was of Elizabeth pregnant, still working at the restaurant just a few months before David was born. She was leaning over a table taking an order, with one hand discreetly on her belly. David froze when he saw that image. It was the first time he had seen his mother pregnant with him, and there was something deeply moving about it. Elizabeth had a calm expression in the photo, as if she knew that despite all the complications, everything would work out in the end. The grand reopening was scheduled for a Friday evening. David decided that the first customers would be precisely the people who had been part of the story: Anthony, Robert, Jessica, Jennifer, Ethan, Henry, and some former employees that Jessica managed to track down. On the morning of the reopening, David woke up early with a knot in his stomach. It was fear mixed with excitement. He had invested everything in that project, not just money, but also emotions, dreams, hopes. If the restaurant failed, it wouldn't just be a business closing, but a family legacy being lost. Ethan noticed his father's anxiety and suggested they spend the morning together in the restaurant's kitchen, just preparing ingredients and talking. It was exactly what David needed. While they chopped vegetables, seasoned meats, and prepared sauces, father and son talked about everything and nothing. Ethan confessed that he was thinking about changing his career choice. He had always imagined he would be an engineer like his uncle, but now he wanted to study culinary arts. David asked if he was sure if he wasn't just being influenced by the recent emotion of meeting Anthony. The boy said no, that he had actually always enjoyed cooking, but never took it seriously. Meeting Anthony and discovering the family history just confirmed something that was already there. He wanted to continue the tradition, but also add his own voice, his own creations. David hugged his son tightly. He said he would support any decision he made, but that he was happy to know that he might have a partner in the kitchen in the future. Ethan smiled and said that had always been the idea. Jessica arrived at noon, bringing even more photographs. She had found an old album at her mother's house that contained pictures of Anthony and Elizabeth together, obviously before everything got complicated. They were photos of happy moments, of genuine smiles, of a love that unfortunately couldn't be. David looked at each image carefully. There was one in particular that touched him deeply. Anthony and Elizabeth were in the restaurant kitchen, him teaching her how to prepare some dish. Both were laughing, completely absorbed in that moment of connection. It was exactly the same scene David had experienced with Ethan that morning. The same kitchen, the same love for food, the same desire to share knowledge. The tradition was repeating itself, but this time without secrets, without hidden pain. Robert appeared right after lunch. He brought a special bottle of wine that he had saved for years, waiting for the right occasion to open it. He said this was definitely the occasion. The wine was an Argentinian red from 1985, the year David was born. Anthony was the last to arrive, brought by the same nurse from the nursing home. He was visibly more fragile than at the reconciliation dinner 2 weeks earlier. The doctors had warned that he was deteriorating quickly, but the old man refused to miss the opening. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The opening ceremony was simple but moving. David gave a short speech thanking everyone for their presence and support. He briefly told the story of the restaurant, talked about Anthony and Elizabeth, about Robert and Jessica, about how all those people were connected through that special place. Then it was Anthony's turn to speak. The old man asked to get up from the wheelchair, saying he wanted to do this standing. With help from David and Robert, he steadied himself and began his speech. Anthony said he built that restaurant with 2 dreams in mind: to create a place where people felt at home and one day pass that place to the son he never got to raise. He thought only the first dream would come true, but life had its own plans. Now seeing David there running the kitchen, continuing the legacy, Anthony could say that both dreams had come true. He concluded by saying that food is more than nutrition, it's memory, it's love, it's connection. Every dish prepared in that restaurant would carry their story, and he hoped customers could feel that when tasting the food. The first tables were occupied by special guests. David had prepared a special tasting menu for that evening, with 5 dishes representing different phases of the restaurant's history. The first dish surprised everyone. It was a modern reinterpretation of the shrimp with passion fruit sauce that Anthony had created. David kept the essence of the recipe, but added contemporary elements, showing that tradition and innovation could coexist harmoniously. Anthony tasted it and smiled broadly. He said his son had taken his creation and brought it to another level, exactly as it should be. One generation learns from the previous one but doesn't limit itself to copying. It evolves. The second dish was Elizabeth's Sicilian lemon risotto, prepared in the traditional way without modifications. David explained that some recipes are perfect as they are and don't need improvements, just respect and careful execution. The third was a surprise created by Ethan under David's guidance. It was a dish the boy had developed, inspired by conversations with Anthony. A chicken moqueca with touches of Floridian cuisine, but using techniques he learned watching cooking shows. Everyone was impressed with the flavor and presentation. Robert joked, saying he now had 3 chefs in the family and would never go hungry again. Jennifer laughed and said Robert was more likely to gain weight than go hungry with all that abundance. The fourth dish was mountain chicken, served exactly as Anthony made it during the restaurant's golden decades. It was the signature dish, representing the essence of mountain spice, and now of our mountain spice. The entire table fell silent after the first bite. It wasn't just taste buds being satisfied, it was something deeper. It was the feeling of belonging, of being part of something bigger, of being connected through time and generations. The fifth and final dish was a collaborative dessert. David, Ethan, and Jessica had worked together to create something representing the restaurant's future. It was a deconstruction of Elizabeth's cornmeal cake with guava paste, presented elegantly while maintaining all the nostalgic flavors. Henry from the bank, who tasted each dish with professional critic seriousness, declared it was the best meal he'd had in years. He predicted our mountain spice would become a culinary reference, not just in Aspen, but throughout New York's mountain region. As the evening progressed, other customers began arriving. They were people who had heard about the reopening, former regulars who missed the place, curious folks drawn by the moving story that was already circulating through town. David divided his time between the kitchen and dining room, ensuring everything ran perfectly. Ethan took a position in the kitchen, helping with simpler dishes but executing everything with care and attention to detail. Jennifer watched everything with pride. She told Jessica she'd never seen David so complete, so at peace with himself. The discovery of the truth, however painful initially, had freed him from something he didn't even know he was carrying. Jessica agreed and confessed she felt an enormous weight lifted from her shoulders. She had carried that secret since her teens, always afraid everything would explode destructively one day. But in the end, the truth brought unity instead of division. Robert and Anthony sat together at a corner table, talking like old friends. They spoke about Elizabeth, sharing different memories of the same amazing woman. Robert talked about Elizabeth, the mother, wife, homemaker. Anthony spoke of the young Elizabeth, dreamy, passionate about life. At one point, Robert put his hand on Anthony's shoulder and said something nobody else heard. But everyone saw Anthony wipe a tear from his face and nod, as if he'd finally received the absolution he'd been seeking for decades. The opening night was an absolute success. All tables remained occupied, the dishes were praised, and the restaurant's welcoming atmosphere made people feel at home. David received compliments not just for the food, but also for the place's story, which was beautifully and elegantly told on the main wall mural. When the last customer left, it was past midnight. The small staff David had hired helped with basic cleaning, but he asked everyone to go home and rest. I wanted to be alone in the restaurant for a few moments, absorbing everything that had happened. Sitting at one of the tables, David looked around. Every corner of that place told a story. The walls that Anthony had painted, The counter where Elizabeth smiled at customers, the tables where families had shared meals for years. And now his own mark, his own contribution to that legacy. He thought about how strange and unpredictable life is. Months ago, he was just a chef working in other people's restaurants, dreaming of having his own place. Now he not only had a restaurant, but had also gained a father, reconnected with his family, and discovered a story of love and sacrifice that had shaped his entire existence. The phone rang, pulling David from his thoughts. It was the nurse from the nursing home, calling to let him know that Anthony had insisted on returning there instead of going to relatives' homes. He said he wanted to sleep in his own bed, dreaming of the success of the opening. David thanked her for the notice and promised to visit Anthony the next day. He knew the old man's time was running out, and he wanted to make the most of every available moment to strengthen the connection they had finally found. In the days that followed, our Mountain Spice quickly established itself as one of the most popular places in Aspen. The food was excellent, the service warm, and the moving story attracted people from all over the region. David implemented the idea of monthly community events, as he had promised Henry. On the last Sunday of each month, the restaurant served free lunch to people in vulnerable situations. It was a way to give back all the support they had received and to honor the community spirit that Anthony had always wanted for the place. Ethan started working at the restaurant every weekend and during school vacations. He was still young, but he showed a natural talent that impressed even the most demanding customers. David noticed traces of Anthony in his son, not only in his cooking skills, but also in his dedication and love for what he did. Robert became a regular at the restaurant. He had lunch there at least 3 times a week, always bringing friends to see the place. He had become the biggest promoter of our Mountain Spice, telling the restaurant's story to anyone who would listen. Jessica also found her place in the operation. She took over the administrative management of the restaurant, handling accounts, suppliers, and legal matters. David discovered that his sister had a talent for numbers and organization, freeing him to focus on what he truly loved, the kitchen. Jennifer continued her own career as a teacher, but became a sort of unofficial advisor to the restaurant. Her experience in dealing with people and resolving conflicts was valuable, especially when delicate situations arose with customers or employees. 3 weeks after the opening, David received a call he had been dreading. Anthony had taken a significant turn for the worse and was hospitalized again. The doctors said there wasn't much they could do except keep him comfortable. David closed the restaurant immediately and went to the hospital. He found Anthony conscious but very weak. The old man smiled when he saw his son and asked him to come closer. Anthony said he was ready. He had lived much longer than he expected, and more importantly had managed to fulfill all his dreams in the last few months. He had met his son, seen his grandson, witnessed the reopening of the restaurant, and made peace with his past. David held his father's hand, feeling the fragile bones under the thin skin. He said he wasn't ready to let him go, that there was still so much he wanted to learn, so many recipes Anthony hadn't taught him yet. Anthony chuckled softly and replied that David already knew everything he needed to know. The rest was just practice and experience, things he would gain over the years. The most important things, the love for gastronomy, the respect for tradition, and the courage to innovate. David already had all of that. The old man asked for one final favor. He wanted David to prepare one last meal for him, something special that could be his farewell. David knew exactly what to do. He left the hospital and went straight to the restaurant. Even though it was 3 in the morning, he entered the kitchen and began preparing the dish with more love and care than he had ever put into any creation. It was a special version of mountain chicken, made with the finest ingredients David could find. Every step of the recipe was executed perfectly, each spice measured precisely, every technique applied masterfully. As he cooked, David cried. Tears fell silently, while his hands worked almost automatically, guided by muscle memory and instinct. He knew this would be the last time he would cook specifically for Anthony. The dish was ready as the sun began to rise. David carefully packed it and returned to the hospital. The doctors allowed him to bring the food into the room, even bending a few hospital rules. They understood the importance of that moment. Anthony was awake, waiting. David helped the old man sit up in bed, and set everything up on a small makeshift table. He cut the chicken into small pieces to make it easier to chew and served it with great affection. Anthony took the first bite and closed his eyes. He chewed slowly, savoring every nuance of flavor. When he opened his eyes again, they glistened with tears. The old man said it was perfect, better than perfect. David had taken his recipe and reached a level he had never achieved. That was how it should be, each generation surpassing the previous one, keeping the essence but adding something new. They ate together in silence, sharing that final moment of connection through food. When Anthony could no longer eat, he simply sat there looking at David with an expression of pure peace. The old man began to talk about life, about regrets and joys. He said that if he could go back in time, he would fight harder to be part of David's life from the beginning. But he also understood that the decisions he made at the time seemed right, based on what he thought would be best for everyone. David interrupted him, saying there was no room for regrets now. What mattered was that they had that moment, that time together, and it was more valuable than any alternative from the past. Robert arrived at the hospital shortly after, bringing Ethan and Jessica. Jennifer came soon after. Everyone gathered around Anthony's bed, forming a circle of love and support. Anthony looked at each person in the room, memorizing their faces and expressions. He thanked everyone once more, his voice growing weaker. When his eyes landed on Ethan, he smiled and asked the boy to come closer. Anthony held his grandson's hand and said he was sure Ethan would become an even better chef than David, that he would take the family tradition to unimaginable places. But more important than being a great chef, Anthony hoped Ethan would be a good person, that he would cook with love and use his talent to feed not just bodies, but also souls. Ethan promised he would do all that and more. He said he would always remember Anthony, that he would tell his great-grandfather's stories to his own children and grandchildren, keeping the memory alive of the man who started it all. The hours passed with everyone there, talking softly, sharing memories, simply being present. Anthony drifted in and out of moments of lucidity and confusion, but whenever he regained consciousness, he smiled to see that he was not alone. In the early afternoon, Anthony called David once more. He said he was tired, that it was time to rest. David held his father's hand and said it was okay, that he could go in peace, that everyone would be fine. Anthony nodded slightly. His eyes closed, and his breathing became slower, softer. David continued holding his hand, feeling when life quietly left the old man's body. There was a moment of absolute silence in the room. Then Jessica began to cry softly, followed by Jennifer. Robert put his hand on David's shoulder in a gesture of silent solidarity. Ethan snuggled up next to his father, also with tears in his eyes. The following days were difficult. David organized the wake and Anthony's farewell, ensuring it was a celebration of his life rather than just a moment of sadness. The wake took place at our mountain spice itself, with doors open to the entire community. Hundreds of people attended. Many whom David didn't even know came to share stories about Anthony. Long-time customers of the restaurant told about special moments, about how Anthony's food had marked birthdays, weddings, family celebrations. An elderly lady approached David and said that Anthony had saved her family during a difficult time. When she lost her job and couldn't feed her children, Anthony discreetly left meal packages at her doorstep, always with an anonymous note saying not to give up. Several other people told similar stories. Anthony helped many people over the years, always discreetly, never seeking recognition. He believed that food was a right, not a privilege, and did his part to ensure no one in his neighborhood went hungry. David realized he knew only a small part of who Anthony really was. The grumpy man who criticized food was just a facade to hide a generous heart and a kind soul. The farewell ceremony was simple, but moving. David gave a speech where he summarized Anthony's life, spoke about the legacy he left, about how the restaurant would continue to be a beacon of community and good food in Aspen. Ethan asked to say a few words too. With a trembling but firm voice, he spoke about the little time he had with his great-grandfather, but how those moments were intense and transformative. He promised he would honor Anthony's memory through his own journey in gastronomy. Robert surprised everyone by also speaking up. He talked about the agreement he had made with Anthony so many years ago, about how it was difficult at first, but how he came to deeply respect the other man. Robert said Anthony was an example of true love, love that puts the needs of others above one's own. After the ceremonies, David returned to the restaurant alone. He needed to process everything that had happened, and that was the place where he felt most connected to Anthony. Sitting in the kitchen, David opened the recipe notebook that Anthony had given to Ethan. He flipped through the pages, reading each recipe, each note, each culinary secret passed down through generations. At the end of the notebook, there was a blank page and a pen attached to the spiral. David understood the message. Now it was his turn to contribute, to add his own recipes to the family legacy. He took the pen and began to write, documenting the special dish he had prepared for Anthony in his final moments. He wrote not only the ingredients and preparation method, but also the story behind the dish. He explained that this version of mountain chicken should be prepared only on special occasions, when one wanted to demonstrate unconditional love to someone. The following weeks were about adapting to the new reality. The restaurant continued to operate well, but there was a palpable sadness in the air. David missed knowing that Anthony was at the nursing home, waiting for his visits. He missed the conversations about cuisine, the stories about the past, the old man's smile when he tasted a well-prepared dish. One afternoon, about a month after Anthony's passing, a letter arrived at the restaurant. It was from the nursing home administrator, informing him that Anthony had left some belongings that should be given to David. David went to Hope Haven the next day. The administrator took him to a small storage room where there was a box with Anthony's things. Inside were simple clothes, some books, and a folder of documents. David took everything to the restaurant and began examining it. Among the documents were old certificates from culinary courses that Anthony had taken throughout his life, newspaper clippings about the success of Mountain Spice Restaurant, and letters exchanged with Elizabeth during the brief period they were together. But what caught David's attention the most was a larger envelope at the bottom of the folder. Inside were architectural plans for an expansion of the restaurant. Anthony had hired an architect years ago to design what it would be like if Mountain Spice grew, becoming an even more special place. The plans were beautiful. They included an outdoor area with a garden, a private room for events, an expanded kitchen, and even a small space for culinary classes. It was Anthony's complete dream, a place that would be more than a restaurant. It would be a center of culinary culture. David showed the plans to Jessica and Robert. Everyone was impressed with Anthony's vision. Jessica immediately started doing calculations, trying to understand if it would be financially feasible to implement those ideas. To everyone's surprise, the numbers weren't impossible. With the success the restaurant was having, perhaps in 2 or 3 years they could start the expansion. It would be a long-term project but achievable. David decided he would make it happen. It would be his way of honoring Anthony, of turning his father's dreams into reality. He framed the plans and put them on the restaurant wall next to the photo mural as a promise of what was to come. Ethan was excited about the idea of the space for culinary classes. He suggested they start by offering free workshops for young people in the community, teaching not only cooking techniques, but also about the history of cuisine, nutrition, and entrepreneurship. The idea was embraced by everyone. It was exactly the kind of initiative Anthony would approve of, using food as a tool for education and social transformation. David began planning the first workshop, which would take place in 3 months. Life went on. The restaurant prospered, the family had truly come together, and Anthony's legacy continued to live on through every dish served, every recipe taught, every person fed. Jennifer and David began to reconnect in a different way. They wouldn't get back together as a couple, that was clear to both of them, but their friendship and mutual respect had deepened. They had dinner together at least once a week, usually at the restaurant, talking about Ethan, about life, about future plans. In one of these conversations, Jennifer revealed something that surprised David. She said she had always noticed that he had an inexplicable sadness within him, a kind of emptiness that nothing seemed to completely fill. Now, after discovering his true story, that emptiness had disappeared. David confirmed it was true. He had always felt like something was missing but never knew what it was. Now he understood it was the connection to his origin, to his complete story. Meeting Anthony, however brief it had been, had closed a circle he didn't even know was open. Robert also went through transformations. He had always been a reserved man, keeping his feelings to himself, but after that whole experience, he became more open, more willing to express love and appreciation for the people around him. One evening during a family dinner at the restaurant, Robert made an unexpected announcement. He said he was officially retiring and wanted to spend his later years helping at Our Mountain Spice. Not in the kitchen, since he was never a good cook, but perhaps serving customers, telling stories, being a welcoming presence. David was moved by the proposal. Having Robert there every day would be wonderful. The man who raised him, who was a father in every way that truly mattered, would have his guaranteed place in the restaurant that meant so much to the whole family. Jessica also made a revelation that night. She said she was breaking up with her long-term boyfriend because she realized they had nothing in common anymore. That whole experience with the family made her rethink her priorities, understand what really mattered in life. She planned to take a big trip through some culinary cities in the United States, learning about regional cuisine and perhaps bringing new ideas to the restaurant. David thought the idea was fantastic and promised to fund the trip as a way of thanking Jessica for all the work she had been doing in administrative management. Ethan was preparing to take his college entrance exams. He still had 2 years ahead of him, but he had already decided he wanted to study culinary arts at the best university possible. He researched programs, visited colleges, talked with professionals in the field. David offered to pay for his son's studies, but Ethan said he wanted to earn a scholarship on his own merit. It was his way of proving, mainly to himself, that he was following that path out of passion and talent, not just family convenience. 6 months after Anthony's passing, Our Mountain Spice received its first professional review. A renowned food critic from New York visited the restaurant anonymously and later published an extremely positive review. The critic praised not only the quality of the food, but also the unique atmosphere of the place. He wrote about how the restaurant managed to be both sophisticated and welcoming, modern and traditional. And he especially highlighted the family story behind the establishment, saying that this authenticity was felt in every detail. The review brought a wave of new customers. People came from neighboring towns specifically to experience Our Mountain Spice. David had to hire more staff to handle the demand. With growth came new challenges. David had to balance the need to serve more customers with maintaining the quality and personal touch that made the restaurant special. He refused to industrialize processes or sacrifice ingredients for savings. Ethan became essential during this period. Even while still studying, he worked at the restaurant whenever possible, helping to maintain high standards. Father and son developed an impressive synchronization in the kitchen, communicating with glances and minimal gestures. Robert kept his promise and started working at the restaurant almost every day. He became a kind of official host, greeting customers, telling stories about the place, making everyone feel special. Regular customers loved talking with him, hearing his stories about David as a child, about the old days in Aspen. Jessica returned from her trip with thousands of photos, notebooks full of recipes and renewed energy, and she had visited restaurants in Louisiana, Florida, Texas, Montana, learning about different American culinary traditions. Her idea was to create an annual food festival at Our Mountain Spice, celebrating the culinary diversity of the United States. Each month would feature a special focus on a different region, with typical dishes and stories about the origin of each recipe. David loved the proposal and began planning its implementation. It would be another way to honor Anthony's spirit, who always wanted the restaurant to be a place of celebration and cultural sharing. 1 year after the restaurant's reopening, David decided it was time to hold the first major community event. He organized a free lunch on Mother's Day, inviting single mothers and women in vulnerable situations from the area. The event was an emotional success. Over 100 women attended, many bringing their children. David, Ethan, and the entire restaurant staff served with love and respect, ensuring that each person felt valued. During the event, one of the women present approached David and said that Anthony had helped her years ago when she was going through a difficult divorce. The old man gave her a job in the restaurant's kitchen, even though she had no experience, and taught her everything she needed to know. The woman, named Susan, said that after working with Anthony, she managed to establish herself as a professional cook and now worked at a school feeding children. She was there to give back a little of what she had received, offering to help with future community events. David accepted immediately, and Susan became a regular volunteer. She brought a different perspective, institutional kitchen experiences that helped optimize processes when they needed to feed many people. The culinary workshops for youth began as planned. The first group had 20 teenagers from public schools in the area, all interested in learning about cooking. David and Ethan taught the classes together, covering everything from basic techniques to more elaborate dishes. One of the students, a boy named Tyler, just 15 years old, showed exceptional talent. David was impressed with how easily he understood flavors, combined ingredients, and executed techniques. It was like seeing a young Anthony in action. David decided to offer Tyler an informal scholarship, allowing him to work at the restaurant on weekends, learning directly from the professionals. The boy accepted enthusiastically, and his presence brought a youthful and renewed energy to the team. Ethan and Tyler quickly developed a friendship. Despite the small age difference, they shared a passion for gastronomy and spent hours talking about recipes, techniques, and culinary dreams. Jennifer watched everything with satisfaction. She saw that David had found not only his calling, but also his mission, using gastronomy as a tool for social transformation, just as Anthony had done more discreetly. 2 years after the reopening of Our Mountain Spice, David felt it was time to begin the expansion Anthony had dreamed of. The restaurant had sufficient funds, and more importantly, a solid customer base and an established reputation. He hired the same architect that Anthony had used years ago, now much older, but still active. The architect was moved to learn that his plans would finally be realized. He made some necessary updates, but kept the essence of Anthony's original vision. Construction began during Aspen's low tourist season. It was a complex project that would require closing the restaurant for 3 months. David was nervous about it, afraid of losing customers, but Jessica reassured him, saying the restaurant's fan base was solid enough to survive a temporary hiatus. During the closure period, David took the opportunity to travel. He, Ethan, and Robert took a trip through Italy, exploring the cuisine of the country that has so greatly influenced American cooking. It was a transformative experience for everyone, especially for Ethan, who was seeing the world beyond the United States for the first time. When they returned, the construction was nearly complete. The result was even more impressive than in the plans. The outdoor garden was a green oasis in the middle of the city. The private dining room was elegant and cozy. The expanded kitchen allowed more cooks to work simultaneously without getting in each other's way. And the space for classes was perfect, with modern equipment and comfortable seating. The reopening of the expanded Our Mountain Spice was scheduled for a Friday evening, almost exactly 3 years after David had bought the restaurant and found Elizabeth's letters in the basement. End of story. So what did you think of David's story? What? Were you moved by this family that found their way back to each other? Leave your opinion in the comments and tell us if you've ever experienced something similar. Don't forget to like the video and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next emotional stories. Your presence here makes all the difference.